Again, aloha and welcome to our George Chaplin Fellowship in Distinguished Journalism address. We're talking about a really important topic tonight, and that's public trust in the media. It's not just an important issue in the United States, but around the world. And as we all know, it's very difficult to sustain a vibrant democracy if you don't have public trust in media. So thank you for coming on to this very important program. Now I would like to introduce our keynote speaker. Ms. Elizabeth Jensen was appointed to a 3-year term as National Public Radio's Ombudsman public editor in January 2015. In this role, she serves as the public's representative to NPR, responsible for bringing transparency to matters of NPR's journalism and journalism ethics. The Ombudsman public editor receives thousands of listener and reader inquiries annually and responds to significant queries, comments, and criticisms. Since starting as Ombudsman public editor, Ms. Jensen has examined NPR's coverage of the 2016 election, diversity in the newsroom, and other current events. She has spent decades taking an objective look at the media business. As a contributor to the New York Times, she covered public broadcasting, as well as children's media, documentaries, non-profit journalism startups, and cable programming. Over her 3 decades in journalism, she has reported on journalistic decision-making, mergers and acquisitions, content, institutional transformations, the intersection of media and politics, advertising, and more for national news organizations. She spent 6 years at the Wall Street Journal, where she was part of a team of reporters that was honored for their coverage of the tobacco industry. She's also been a television reporter for the New York Daily News. And in 2005, Ms. Jensen was a recipient of a Chaplin Fellowship in Public Affairs Journalism at Ohio State University. She focused her research on media politicization. She earned her MA in International Relations from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University and her undergraduate degree from Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism. And when she's not covering media, Elizabeth has taught food journalism at New York University and has occasionally reported on the food world, including investigating vegetarian marshmallow fraud for CNBC News Magazine report. So that was my favorite part of the bio. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Derek, and thank you, Susan. And thank you to the East West Center for this warm welcome. It's my pleasure to be here tonight. I've learned a little bit about George Chaplin in recent days. I spent the vast majority of my career, as Susan just said, in newspapers. I've been privileged to work with some extraordinary editors. They were tough and passionate, just as I've learned Mr. Chaplin was, as he built his newspaper into an important voice here in Hawaii. Thanks, Mr. Chaplin. I'm here to talk about a subject that, as you note, I'm sure he would find of great interest: rebuilding public trust in the media. Rebuilding. Because as you here at the East West Center have rightly identified, we find ourselves at a time when numerous polls show that Americans are expressing unprecedented levels of mistrust and even dismissal of the media writ large. If you work in the media, you know what I'm talking about. You have only to open your Twitter feed every morning and you're the recipient of all of this. And if you don't work in the media, you've no doubt heard the numbers, or you've at least read the panicky headlines that really began in earnest last September. That's when Gallup, the polling organization, released the results of its annual survey of Americans' trust and confidence in the mass media to report the news. Figure had fallen 8 percentage points in just 1 year. And it was the lowest level in Gallup polling history since 1972, when Gallup first asked the question. And, you know, it's not for nothing that poll was taken even before the November election, which has brought a whole new round of talk about whether the media can be trusted. So we'll all be quite interested to see where the numbers are landing this year when the poll comes out. The numbers have inspired a lot of doom and gloom in newsrooms and also outside. And they've prompted some very sobering questions of whether we can fix this broken state. And if we can, what's the cost? Or, put it another way, What is the cost to our democracy if we don't succeed? That last one is the real concern here. It's not about media jobs. It's about the fear that democracy itself will suffer without a robust media. We have built our system on the premise that a vital media makes enlightened participants of its citizens and holds accountable our elected officials. I don't have a crystal ball. Most importantly, I don't know whether any new technology is percolating in some Silicon Valley genius's brain, or for that matter these days in the brain of some 12-year-old, that could upend journalism and the way it reaches audiences in the same way that the internet and more recently mobile technology has racked our business and our society in recent years. But as NPR's Ombudswoman for the last 2 years, I've had a fairly unique vantage point to observe some of these issues. In the questions that listeners and readers pose, I'm seeing some possibilities for solutions. In addition, new research continues to come out that is giving us a better insight into what news consumers see as trustworthy journalism. So there are steps that can be taken to rebuild public trust. It will most certainly be worth the time and the effort and the cost. There will be a cost. Today I want to take you through my thoughts on how we got into this situation. I'll look at some of the most immediate challenges we face and what some news organizations are already doing to address the problem. And I will end with some ideas for how to foster rebuilding, because I'm fundamentally hopeful that we can come out stronger on the other side of this journey. To understand some of the possible solutions, it's important to understand why Americans are expressing such unprecedented frustration with the media. Many of these factors that led us to this point are intertwined. It's hard to separate out the fast-changing business model of media outlets and from the larger societal changes that are taking place. What is cause and what is effect are not so easy to pick apart. And the problem has been decades in the making. We're talking about it more now, but this goes back a long, long time. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. So let's start with some broad societal trends. Americans have been expressing declining levels of trust in many institutions for decades. It's not just the media. I'll start with one example to illustrate how many institutions have undergone this reevaluation. I've been struck by a theme I see repeated in many analyses about this issue that of media trust, and that's the adulation that was heaped on the journalism of the late 1960s and early 1970s, a high point in the country's relationship to the press. There was indeed some stellar journalism during that time. The reports on the civil rights struggles, the daring reporting from Vietnam and Watergate. But on second look, overall, this was a mainstream journalism that was dominated by white men. The few women and minorities at that time had to scrap for the plum assignments and space in the paper or on the air. It was a journalism heavily focused on the goings-on in Washington. To many, it was not journalistic nirvana. It was a club that excluded many talented people who could have expanded the conversation much more quickly. I bring it up only to say that, this is the kind of reevaluation that many Americans are undergoing with many institutions, from organized religion, public schools, science. Americans are starting to think for themselves. And if Gallup's trust in media figures seem bad, consider this, that in 2016, 9%, just 9% of those polled said they had a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in Congress. So it kind of looks good for the media. The Pew Research Center last week released its own polling on public trust in government that shows a similar pattern. Just 2 in 10 Americans say they can trust the government in Washington to do what is right just about always or most of the time. That's a near historic low. I should add that per Gallup's polling, only the military has bucked the trend, with a 15% jump in public confidence since 1973. Bill Bishop, who wrote with Robert Cushing The Big Sort, Why the Clustering of Like-Minded America is Tearing Us Apart, unpacked some of this last month in the Washington Post, and I'd really urge you all, if you're interested in this topic, to look at his article. His piece was headlined, Americans Have Lost Faith in Institutions, and That's Not Because of Trump or Fake News. He cites rising incomes, modernization, increased education and technology as factors that have led inexorably to a prioritizing of individualism over the communal good for this decline in institutional trust. Americans increasingly, as I said earlier, think for ourselves and about ourselves. It's also worth singling out some other historical developments. A few of these were policy changes over the last few decades, including some involving the media. The creation of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting in 1968 and the arrival of PBS and later NPR expanded the news offerings nationwide. PBS in particular was met with immediate distrust by the Nixon administration that was the target of some of its negative reporting. In 1987, the Reagan-era Federal Communications Commission abolished the Fairness Doctrine. That public policy had been in place since 1949 and required that holders of broadcast licenses for television and radio stations regularly provide multiple opposing perspectives about important public issues. An earlier attempt to turn that doctrine into law had failed when Reagan vetoed it, calling it antagonistic to the freedom of expression guaranteed by the First Amendment. And with the rolling back of that doctrine, talk radio, most of it from the right, blossomed. The FCC also gradually began lifting the limits on the number of media outlets one company could own. And I note that those limits were just expanded again last month. And this morning we woke to the news that Sinclair Broadcast Group, which is already the owner of the most TV stations in the country, is merging with Tribune Media. So another large group, so this will create the largest television group we've ever seen. As media groups get bigger, of course, their voices are amplified, and some of those are partisan voices. Technological changes play a role too. As news flourished in a rapidly growing cable infrastructure, those outlets increasingly found a business model in partisanship. Most notable among these, of course, was the arrival of Fox News in 1996, which built its business playing to conservative misgivings about mainstream news organizations, misgivings that had been nurtured over the years by deep-pocketed individuals working through think tanks to foment some of this distrust of the media. And of course, news organizations themselves must shoulder some of the blame for declining levels of trust. In his Washington Post article, Bill Bishop talked about some straightforward historical reasons why institutions have lost influence. But what also caught my eye, if you read it, are the comments on the piece. The commenters didn't really care about history. They really wanted to point the blame at the media for its own demise. Going all the way back, if you think about it, to Dateline NBC's fake explosion rigging of a GM truck to illustrate a 1992 story about safety defects. So that was 25 years. People have long memories. Media organizations have gotten big stories wrong. You referred to the false reports that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq leading up to the 2003 invasion. Last fall's election reporting that was underpinned with an assumption that Hillary Clinton had the presidency locked up. These are big stories that the press got wrong, and they've taken a toll, I think, on media trust. So I think the media has to acknowledge some of its own role here. Other decisions played a role in fostering distrust too. Cable networks that prioritized talking heads over reporting, or print media that conflated opinion, analysis, and straight reporting. Sometimes it's impossible to tell these days what voice a person is speaking with. It's all of a piece: policy, technology, changing society, business decisions, and just plain errors. It's all led to a place where news consumers began drifting to ideological corners, trusting some media that reflected their own views, and distrusting others. We will never know how these tendencies would have played out had it not been for the twin technological thunderbolts, that the internet and mobile technology. The arrival of the digital era not only roiled journalism's business model, it accelerated these societal trends and abetted a whole other level of distrust. Social media, as we've already noted, has made it far easier for individuals to express their doubts about stories and to disseminate their own opinions. We declaim more than we listen these days. We cherry-pick facts to bolster beliefs. Ideas gain momentum in a like-minded hive that assembles online as consumers cluster in political thought bubbles, never having to confront an alternative point of view. And as an aside, these online bubbles are increasingly mirrored in the physical communities we live in as well. Facebook encouraged the news bubble situation last year with an algorithmic serving up of red and blue news feeds, so users only saw their views reinforced. Again, they saw very little in the way of counter-argument. Was this a political act? No, it was just a business one designed to increase clicks. Even one of my favorite former editors succumbed to the temptation the other day. I'm going to spare him the embarrassment. I'm not going to name him, but he posted a story with the introduction. Who knows if this is true, but this certainly fits the pattern. He was roundly called out, and he took the post down. But, you know, that's our tendency these days. So, as you noted, this news phenomenon, news we agree with being seen as somehow not worth verifying, and a tendency to label untrustworthy the stories that go against our own beliefs, is separate from the entire other category of fake news. Deliberately false stories, many manufactured overseas by people looking to make a quick buck off the digital hits. And yet there's yet another category of fake news that is coming from agent states seeking to influence elections. An Oxford University study showed that Twitter users in Michigan, a battleground state in 2016, received as much fake or untrustworthy news between November 1 and 11 as they did professional news content. Think about that for a minute. And then question whether you're going to get your news from Twitter going forward. The business ramifications of this digital onslaught have taken a toll as well. Take copy editing. As the profitability of print media outlets dropped in the switch to digital, one of the first groups of employees to feel the effects was the copy editors. Those are the wonderful employees whose role it is in the newsroom to uphold standards and practices, to save reporters from misreporting the facts, to cast that final critical eye looking at nuance in headlines. Their ranks have been dramatically thinned. If you work in a newsroom, you know. You sometimes feel like you don't have a backup at times. The result is obvious to anyone who reads a newspaper or a website. Errors are up from the misplaced apostrophe in its to dropped words, misspellings, and worse. Can something as simple as firing copy editors make a difference? Well, when the Media Insight Project asked Americans last year about the most important factor inspiring their trust in a news organization, the answer was accuracy, getting the facts right. A more severe effect of the digital era has been the culling of local newspapers. The Seattle Post-Intelligencer, the Rocky Mountain News, the Cincinnati Post, the Albuquerque Tribune, the Pittsburgh Tribune-Gazette. That's just to name a few. Other papers, such as the Flint Journal, have survived, but they only publish a few times a week. The newsroom at one of my alma maters, the Los Angeles Times, has shrunk from more than 1,200 people in 2001 to about 430 today. That's a huge, huge toll. Entire swaths of rural areas are without local newspapers. Big national news organizations have benefited as a result, but those organizations are coastal-based. They are in urban multicultural locales. Politico's Jack Schaefer and Tucker Doherty posted eye-opening research last month that confirmed in stark terms just how much of their own bubble national news journalists are living in these days. They live on the coasts in liberal and democratic enclaves. Schaefer wrote, if you're a working journalist, odds aren't just that you work in a pro-Clinton county, odds are that you reside in one of the nation's most pro-Clinton counties. I remember clearly the first time I went back to a high school reunion in mid-Michigan, and I heard an earful from a dear friend about how New York-based journalists were not speaking to her issues. That was 20 years ago, and the divide has only gotten wider. Many journalists I know recount similar experiences. So, after painting such a bleak picture, you might ask, why do I remain optimistic? Partly it's because some very smart minds are throwing themselves at the situation in order to understand it better. It is certainly a preoccupation of the journalism profession these days, and I don't mean the many speeches like this one, and the panels that have been devoted to fake news, journalism ethics, and the war on the media. When the list of next fall's Nieman Fellows came out last week, these are the fellowships that allow journalists to spend an academic year at Harvard University. A full 1/4 of the 24 research projects dealt in some way with this issue of how to distrust in the media and how to solve it. They will join many projects that are already underway. Wikipedia founder Jimmy Wales, you might have seen last month, announced the new Wiki Tribune. It's a news service to be built on the work of both professional journalists and volunteers that will provide free, donation-supported, factual and neutral articles. Then there's an initiative of Santa Clara University's Markula Center for Applied Ethics. Dozens of journalists, including me, have given their time over the last year to what has been dubbed the Trust Project. The goal is to understand, and I'm just going to read here for a minute, how journalism can stand out from the chaotic digital crowd and signal its trustworthiness. The project crafts tangible digital strategies to fulfill journalism's basic pledge to serve society with a truthful, intelligent, and comprehensive account of ideas and events, bake the evidence of trustworthy reporting, accuracy, transparency, inclusion, plainly into news practices, tools, and platforms. Or in short, how can news organizations communicate quickly to news consumers that a story was ethically produced? My own participation has been limited to developing a few best practices that trustworthy journalism adheres to. These include elements such as having an ethics code, a clear corrections policy, transparency as to who funds you, transparency as to who leads the organization, a policy of disclosing any issues on which you express an advocacy voice and why you do so, disclosure of your fact-checking process, and a few more. How to then communicate this to the public is another step. One suggestion has been to add a button, for those of you who remember, a sort of good housekeeping seal of approval, if you like, to digitally shared stories that are ethically produced. So think of your Facebook feed and, it has a little button on the side that says, hey, this article comes with a correction, it was produced by journalists who adhere to all these best practices. Another way to think of that is in terms of marketing. Perhaps trustworthy news organizations just need to do a better job of selling ourselves, making a case for why we are more reliable. We follow best practices. We correct errors quickly. And yes, we have ombudsmen, public editors, who are paid as in-house critics. We certainly need to invest in more news literacy. Over and over, I hear from journalists at NPR member stations about how some listeners have no idea how stories come together anymore. The rigor with which reporters approach a topic, the fact-checking, the levels of editing. As Damian Radcliffe of the University of Oregon notes, better labeling could help too. What is reporting? What is analysis? What is commentary? What is sponsored content from advertisers? Who is paying for this? How do I know what I'm reading? Or let's talk about fact-checking. The 2016 campaign coverage had many problems, but one highlight was the doubling down at many news organizations, including NPR, on fact-checking. Yes, some news consumers are overly quick to see partisanship in the facts that are checked. But overall, these news tools are adding to the movement towards transparency, which many smart minds argue will be a key element in rebuilding trust. Jimmy Wales' new Wiki Tribune is essentially this in a nutshell. Show me your work, not just the answer, as they tell the kids in middle school math classes. Annotate each statement in your story with supporting documents. Hyperlink it. Where did you get this fact? Where did it come from? Or take it a step further. Tell us the questions you asked. How did you reach your conclusions? It's tedious, yes, and it's antithetical to the more, faster news culture of today. It might not work on Twitter, but there are the other places where it might work, and my guess is it's worth it. I also see a bright spot in deeper research that drills down beyond the very broad question of trust in media. What's really important is which media do you trust? Do you trust Kim Kardashian? Do you trust the New York Times? Do you trust NPR? Or not, and why or why not? It's a very broad question to say, do you trust the media? Because as we all know, media means many things to many people these days. The polling shows more of a distrust for national political media, less for local media focused on weather, focused on sports, local news, national reporting about recipes, food. So to be clear, when we talk about trust in media, what we are really talking about here is mistrust of national political and policy coverage. That is actually something that news organizations can work with and already are. Reacting to the devastating effects of the news media's contraction in the last decade, foundations such as Lenfest are investing in tools to support local media. The Center for Cooperative Media is working to bring about local, national news partnerships. NPR itself has a new initiative to help local stations cover state houses and state governance issues in 36 states. Jim Brady's Spirited Media is rolling out innovative local digital news operations in 3 cities so far: Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Denver, all places that have lost newspapers to the digital onslaught. After being blindsided by the 2016 election results, news organizations are realizing they need to hire more staff that are not based on the coasts. More reporters, as someone noted earlier, with diverse backgrounds, ethnically diverse, racially diverse, from diverse economic backgrounds, and yes, of diverse political thought. NPR, to take the example with which I'm most familiar, is not only working with stations on State House reporting, it is ambitiously embarking on a 3-year plan to more closely integrate the news gathering of its member stations in hundreds of communities nationwide with that of the national NPR newsroom, where journalists are clustered primarily in DC, in New York, and Los Angeles. There are huge hurdles to overcome with this plan. It's certainly not guaranteed, but the potential is dramatic. To have a national news organization that has hundreds of eyes and ears across the country, attuned to the residents of this country. So really speaking to people in communities on a daily basis and really understanding what their issues are. And the stations themselves, as you probably know here in Hawaii, are news organizations where citizens can potentially find common ground and meet in a more trusted venue. If folks trust local media more than they trust national media, then that is something that can be used. It's a bold move on NPR's part, but that's what the situation calls for. Finally, back to my point about copy editors. When I first read that Pew poll that showed basic accuracy as the main element of trustworthy journalism, it seemed so obvious that I was a bit baffled. Of course accuracy counts. Isn't that what is drilled into journalists from day one? But the more I thought about that, the more I thought perhaps it offered a glimmer of hope. Those polled weren't saying they didn't like the narrative that was being expressed. They didn't say that they felt there were too many stories devoted to one topic and not another. Those came further down on the list. They simply wanted the basic facts to be accurate. So if one element of rebuilding trust is really as simple as improving our accuracy, then that's a pretty easy fix. Put in some quality control, get back to basics. Yes, it will cost a little bit more, but what is the cost of public trust? I should say as an aside that I argued in a column a couple months ago that NPR was among those that needed to beef up its copy editing ranks for the stories that run on npr.org. And a third copy editor just started last week. So it's a start. Will these steps be enough? There's certainly plenty of counter arguments to be made. We will not ever get back to an era of blind faith in the media. It's just not going to happen. In this intensely partisan era, there are some news consumers who likely just won't be swayed. They've gone to their corners and they aren't coming out for anything. Their suspicions and distrust run too deep when they're not interested in a news organization that presents perspectives that differ from their own. That's frustrating because rebuilding trust will take some goodwill and concerted action on the part of consumers of media, not just news organizations. It's a partnership. Platforms such as Facebook will need to do their part as well. And I get the sense that they are working on it, or they insist they are working on it. That said, I believe many news organizations have heard the message and are taking steps to do their own part, assuming technology does not blindside us once again. I've been saying frequently these days how privileged I am to have my role at one of the most interesting times for journalism. We are thinking through how we approach everything in our jobs. In some cases, that means reevaluating our traditional way of doing things. In other cases, we are putting our heads down and getting back to some key basics of our profession that perhaps we have strayed from. Copy editing, that's as basic as it gets. We are thinking more creatively about how we reach audiences and how to approach our role with rigor. Are the challenges robust? Absolutely. But as part of the global community, you appreciate that it's important that we get this absolutely right. That trust in a vital media ecosystem is one of the underpinnings keeping our democracy strong. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. There's a lot of such interesting information for us all to ponder, journalists and non-journalists. I think that the surveys also show, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the public, the American public, still expects media to be the watchdog. I mean, to report and keep an eye on government. So we still have our job cut out for us. It's just a little more challenging. So thank you very much for giving us some ways that we might do that. We're going to take questions now, and Elizabeth is going to take her own questions, but please, I would just ask that you keep your questions very brief, because I know there's probably lots of stuff out there that you want to ask, so just keep your questions brief. And we'll go ahead and start. Phyllis is taking the microphone around, so I'll let Elizabeth take the podium again. She's going to take the questions. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Any questions? Go ahead, right here. Let's wait for the mic.
I have a different interpretation of what people mean by accuracy.
Okay.
I think yours is kinder. Yours is about objectivity. I think when people critique the accuracy, what they're saying is that it doesn't agree with the ideologies and the worldviews that they have. I think that's much closer to what we know about the psychology of the way people make decisions than I'm not at all saying we don't need more copy editing. I think we certainly, that's a good thing.
It's a pretty basic.
Yeah, it's a pretty basic thing, but
right.
I don't see the accuracy criticism as coming from that narrow a base.
Uh-huh. Are you saying you think it's more, so are there facts though? So that's the
Well,
question, right? Are there facts that we can all agree on?
Yes, there are facts, but people interpret facts, the accuracy of facts in terms of their own ideologies and values. We all pretty much do that.
Right.
And that's a much more perplexing issue, that you can't just deal with it by talking about objectivity.
Right. So one of the things I like to repeat over and over is what is the basic role of journalism? So journalism is designed, we've gotten away from this because we've gone to very heavily into opinion journalism, but the basic role of journalism is to give citizens the facts so that they can make up their own decisions, make up their own minds about sort of policy, et cetera. But it all goes back to the real basics. And I think part of it is we have to remind citizens that is what journalism is designed to do. And I think sometimes we have to remind ourselves that we are, I spoke of this conflation of opinion and analysis and reporting. I think it creeps into a lot of journalism, and we don't label it very well. We just assume that readers and listeners and TV viewers are going to know when we're speaking with one voice or another, and they don't always. So I think part of the solution for me is just really getting back to that basic, this is the story, this is a fact. You can decide for yourself whether you think it's good policy or bad policy, or what we should do about this fact, if you will, but about this situation. Yes.
I have a mic here if you'd
Oh,
like.
sure, go ahead.
Hi,
Sorry,
thank you.
so sorry.
No worries. For starters, thank you so much
You're
for
welcome.
all the work you and your colleagues are doing and for being here with us. My question's a little bit different, though, as we don't often get to hear from a public editor.
Yes.
Your colleagues on a regular basis are putting other things or other issues under the microscope. You're putting journalism and journalists under the microscope.
I am indeed.
So if I'm not prying, or perhaps I am just prying, what is it like for you day to day in this role?
It's so an ombudsman, a public editor, is a very, very interesting role. It's as you say, it's I am paid by NPR, just as the New York Times public editor is paid by the New York Times, to be an in-house critic. I report to the CEO. I'm completely independent. I don't have any sort of, the newsroom has no oversight over my work. So I'm basically there to sort of answer listener and reader concerns. I can raise my own concerns if I want as well. It's a tough job. There's a reason why you have a contract, and it's a term limited position. You're there because you have colleagues, but you're not supposed to get too friendly with them because you need to be independent. You get to the end of your 3-year term, and if you've done your role, you've probably offended some people in the newsroom, and NPR's main office is in DC, and that's where my office is, but I actually work most of my time out of New York, so I only go to DC once a month, and it makes it a little easier. I don't have to sort of see someone in the elevator the next day when I've written something tough. I will say that NPR reporters and hosts have been overall very good. They're very professional. I try to be professional in my job. It's not personal. I think we're all there with the same goal in mind, which is to keep the journalism strong. So I try to approach my job in that spirit, and for the most part, I think people take it in that spirit. It doesn't feel good if you're sort of the target of a ombudsman investigation, but I try to keep it on that plane. So.
Well, thank you for a great talk, and I appreciate your optimism.
I know, it's not, not everyone does, yeah.
I think my area for concern about optimism is the financial motives for major media.
Right.
When the head of CBS says, well, this may not be good for America, but it's good for CBS.
Right.
When Fox's model is entirely, we've got a set of issues that keep an angry audience watching us, and our job is to just feed their anger. When CNN, realizes that it can make a lot more money with opinion and entertainment rather than news, and so mostly it's just running things that are either controversial or lots of people yelling at each other.
Right.
And when you look at things that show real journalism, like Washington Post reporter doing meticulous research about the Trump Foundation, and then, he won the Pulitzer Prize, but most people think the Clinton Foundation was dirtier than the Trump Foundation. In each case, the people who went with entertainment and opinion rather than news made more money. So what's your source of optimism in terms of the financial modeling that will get people into the right space who are making decisions within big media?
It's a very good question. I appreciate it, and as I say, I think I could probably make a case on the other side of the argument that I just made, that there are a lot of negatives. Part of it is consumers. So I think news consumers are going to have to start to vote with their clickers or with their, with their subscription dollars to the New York Times. I think a number of public radio stations have seen terrific pledge drives in recent months, and near as I can tell, some of that is attributable to news consumers stepping up and saying, I want to support quality media. The New York Times just announced, I think last week, it hit a digital high. I mean, I don't remember the exact figures, but it was hundreds of thousands of new digital subscriptions that have been added. So yes, I think it's a partnership on the part of news consumers. I mean, we don't operate in a vacuum. I think the public is going to have to step up and say, I want quality media. I'm not going to watch CNN or, will that happen? I doubt it. Right, but I think we have to build a constituency for quality news. I think we have to, one of the questions I've had recently is there a constituency in this country for, I call it news in the middle, and I don't really like that term, but for news that is nonpartisan, for news that gives you perspectives from all points of view. As I understand it, there's new research that's coming out that will seemingly back that up, or will show ways in which we can, again, work with work with the desires of consumers and what they're looking for to kind of build that constituency. But I think we have to work at it. I think we have to work really hard at it, so.
Yes, my question, you mentioned several institutions, including a low rating of the U.S. Congress.
Yes,
Especially exceptionally low rating of the U.S. Congress.
yes,
And the inability in the traditions of both houses to achieve compromise for the public good.
yes.
To what extent does the media have a role in bringing a correction to that kind of attitude, not only to the Congress itself, but to the expectations of their electorate?
Mm-hmm. I actually don't. I think the role of the news media is to report on the issues and let the consumers decide. Again, I go back to sort of what I said earlier. You know, our job is to give you the information that is needed to make your own decisions. So I don't know that it's the media's role. It's not the media's role to elect one president over the other, one candidate over the other. It's you know, we give you the information and you get to make your own choices. So I appreciate the problem. I mean, it's a huge problem. So you know, the media can only solve its own, ultimately can only solve its own issues, right? So some of these other problems are just bigger, broader societal problems that are going to have to get worked out on their own, I think.
Hi.
Oh, hello.
You talked earlier about distrust in media, and a friend of yours who's from Michigan who was talking about,
Yes.
and I think that it became a big news story because Trump got so much support for disaffected people in those regions, for example.
Yes.
And one thing I think a lot about is my background is in economics, and the news media kind of uncritically uses GDP as a measure for how the economy is doing and if we're in recession or not.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very flawed measure. There's a short, great book by Joe Stiglitz called Mismeasuring Our Lives. He's not the only one who's gone over it. But especially in an age where inequality is rising, the sort of headline for the whole country number is less and less relevant. And it occurred to me when I tried to put me in their heads that because the recovery was so uneven,
Mm-hmm.
I could see how you would distrust these liberal media sources when they're saying the economy is better, we're out of the recession, and you look around yourself and you say, no, it's not. And unemployment is the other big headline number they use. It conveniently ignores long-term unemployed people. Whereas labor force participation, which is almost never used, is hanging out at 35-year lows. I wonder if there's any discussion. And what's so dangerous about those things, I think, is they're considered facts, right? They're numbers that are respected by economists. So is there any discussion of metrics that we use for economic analysis and the complicit nature of the economics discipline and these metrics that are so commonly used in fueling this distrust, especially in an age where experiences in the country are, you know, there's a huge and growing rift between the have and the have-nots?
Yeah, it's a good question. I have seen reporting that sort of gets exactly at that topic. I think I get emails regularly, actually, from listeners and readers who are unhappy. You know, if NPR uses one of those metrics, say, I mean, they want sort of a deeper exploration of the underpinnings of those metrics. I think some of that became a campaign issue, of course, in the past campaign.
Are
Yeah.
there any journalists who you hear talking about it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I can only speak for NPR. So there was actually had a very long conversation with an NPR journalist about this.
Can I have their name? Would they be okay with that?
Yeah, we can talk afterwards.
Okay,
Sure, I'm happy
okay.
to talk to you afterwards about that. Sure. No, people do discuss it. It's very challenging, right? Because these are complicated issues, and the sort of the media's, a mainstream news organization is not necessarily set up to do an in-depth exploration that you're referring to, but I absolutely think it's a completely valid question, right?
Thank you.
I was going to jump on that a little bit,
Okay.
particularly for our international folks here.
Yes.
I just came back from serving in Asia, and so obviously the talk here on the island and going east is about China. And one of the things that you'll hear all the time is they're growing 6.5 percent a year, and it's X number of $1 trillion economy. However, what is your view of the responsibility of reporters for actually not just reading the press release, but in this case, for example, China's economy has only expanded using energy at 0.5%. So if you can tell me how you grow an economy at 6.5% when you only expand energy 0.5%, you have a better chance of catching a unicorn on your way home. So the point is that these are things that just get parroted. And my worry is when you talk about having straight news,
Yes.
Living through the Kerry campaign, for example, John Kerry, when the story came out about the Swift boats, he made a decision not to respond, to elevate it. And I was, we as a campaign were sitting there, and when Ted Koppel completely destroyed the guy who brought the book, I forget his name, and they literally said, well, that'll be over because no one in the press will report it. And the next morning, the guy was on the Today Show saying the exact same story. So in this effort to put a left and a right to make sure everyone has the whole perspective,
Right.
it's a false equivalency.
Right.
And that's the problem that I think we had, certain segments politicizing, and then the mainstream media was trying to bend over backwards to be fair, but they were putting things that were not of equal weight factually. And I see that's the frustration that I see from reporters, is that what is your responsibility, or what is the free press, because I like that analysis a lot better than media, what is that responsibility on things like that?
Well, absolutely. I think false equivalencies are a big topic in newsrooms these days. And newsrooms don't always get it right. I think there was a lot of reporting, as people have said, during the campaign, where frankly it was wrong. There was probably too much of a focus on Hillary Clinton's emails, if you will. I mean, I think most people would agree with that. Not that it's not a story, but the questions of sort of where the balance is. Now, would that have tipped the election? Not necessarily. I mean, that's not again, people vote for many, many different reasons. It's not necessarily because of the information they're receiving, but obviously it's up to a newsroom to try and get the information right and the balance right. And it's not, I've worked as a reporter for 30 years. It's not always obvious when in the heat of the moment sort of where that balance is. Sometimes it's only obvious in retrospect, but absolutely we need to guard against false equivalencies, of course.
I think the only part that makes me
right.
uncomfortable what you just said there, though, is it may not change the election. That's not the standard, right?
No, of course.
We only have little parts to play in it, and that's not the standard.
Right, but again, it's right, but it's not. People vote against their self-interest all the time, so it's not sort of a news organization's role to figure out how people should vote or what they should do. You put out the information, and you again, you have to make a decision about what's the right balance, or if there is a balance, or if you need to report the other side of the story. Sometimes I do think that we get the balance wrong, absolutely. You're not going to get an argument from me there.
Hi. Thank you for a very interesting talk this evening. I wrote a lot of things down that were stirred up from that. My question is this. It seems like Timothy Leary gave a talk once, and he said, be aware of the ownership of the light that enters your eyes, because the ownership is what is causing the distrust, because we see the interest of the ownership reflected in the reporting. Perception media is more important than factual media in this world. So my question is, since that's the source of it, what William McDonough, I'm a sustainability guy, so William McDonough says all sustainability will be local. And what he means by that is that we will all really get our information, our signals from a local source. So what is the effect of localization of media creation and media sources on this distrust that we have because of the ownership question?
Well, I think if I've understood what you're saying, I guess I would argue that it goes the other way. So, the research I've seen says, people don't necessarily trust you if you say, here's what's happening nationally. Here's the trend. Here's what's going to happen if this bill is passed or if this change is made on a national level. What they will trust you is if you take it down to a local level. If you say, okay, this hospital is going to close because of the budget priority made in Washington, or your costs are going to go down for healthcare. I don't know, I'm just making this up. But they will, when it's taken down to the local level, that's where they can relate to it. So that's a little bit what I was talking about, was sort of there's this huge distrust on this national level, but when you actually take it down to the local level, there is much more trust. So I think quite a few news organizations are trying to figure out how to get back to that local level. There's huge challenges because of the financial model for journalism these days. It's very, very difficult. And that's, again, why NPR is trying to sort of put together its own model. There are other models that are going on. I talk about NPR because I happen to be familiar with it, but I think that's what folks are trying to really get at, to say let's figure out a way to sort of bring some of that local sensibility where people can see it. They can see it and they know it with their own job situation, or with their own situation with their families, et cetera. So. Yes.
Which is an NGO that produces media. So
yes.
This is what I'm really trying to bring out. Is there a movement across the nation for these types of local-based production of media
Yes.
that kind of can offset this other model?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think folks are trying to do it. The financial model is very challenging. There have been some, newspapers have folded, and other sort of nonprofit investigative online digital operations have started up. Some of them have succeeded really well, some of them not so well. So, and some of them have folded. So I still think we're still in a period of shaking out. I don't think we're there yet in terms of knowing exactly what's going to work. And I think not every model will work for every community. But if you look at sort of what Jim Brady is doing with Jim Brady he started with a model called Billy Penn, which is a digital operation in Philadelphia. That Philadelphia, again, is one of the cities where newspapers have been very challenged, and there's been a lot of consolidation. So he actually has a for-profit operation that he's gone in and figured out a way to put together a digital news organization that is essentially focusing on areas that the newspapers have let slide. And he's doing this in Denver now and Pittsburgh. He's found some investment money. People are starting to see that there is a model that can work there. So I think everyone's trying to find different kinds of models and see what will work.
Yeah, hi. I'm Bhagya from the Straits Times, Singapore, which is Singapore's main national newspaper. Basically, I had a question on whether you have any tips or guidance on how to report hyperbole. I'm asking this question at this point because you have a president who revels in this kind of communication with a lot of success. So he might say things like, I will be the greatest jobs creating president ever. And from what I've seen, the American media basically would either sort of report it in a sort of dismissive kind of way, or they have some facts and they kind of annotate it and say that this is where he's going wrong, or this is. But either way, I don't know if they're actually reaching people and they are sort of converting minds. Whether they are able to sort of successfully communicate how to treat this president who has the style of speaking. Thank you.
I think it's certainly been a challenge. I think a lot of news organizations have taken different approaches. I guess I would say that, so there's a school of thought that says you shouldn't report it because it is hyperbole. My own personal opinion is we cover the President of the United States, and whatever way he or she wishes to communicate with the public, that's our role. So it's not our role to say we're not going to cover it just because it's hyperbole, if you will. NPR's decision has been to cover it, as you say, with annotation. I think most people have done that. There's this debate over whether to call it a lie or not. There's sort of a dividing line among news organizations. Some are, suggesting that there are lies being told, and others are not. When you get to this idea of civil discourse, somebody talked about civil discourse earlier. If you're a news organization and you're calling a president a liar, you've sort of left that. You've left that realm of civil discourse. That is the argument for that. So I don't think that there's necessarily one answer that fits all for a news organization. I think a news organization has to decide what it wants to be and what its own tone is, if you will.
So sort of, are you saying that it would rest on the credibility of the organization
Absolutely,
then?
yeah. Right. I mean, if someone is putting out factual misinformation, then it needs to be corrected. So it's not a news organization's role to spread misinformation. So if there is misinformation that has been put out, I think you cover it, and then you say that that's my own personal feeling. I don't speak for NPR. I only speak for myself. But my personal feeling is you can cover what is said, but you have to absolutely make sure that it's corrected, because your role is to sort of not spread the misinformation.
But at a time when you say that the public trust in the media is very low, it's 9%, you said, I think?
It's
a Gallup poll that said...
It's 32% overall.
Oh, 9% is the Congress, okay, right.
9%.
So it's still very low. I mean, 1 in 3
Yes.
people aren't believing what you're saying, what the media is saying.
Yes.
So, then it's a catch-22 kind of situation.
Right, of course, right. But again, I think we have to do our job. I speak broadly as a member of the media for the past 30 years. Our job is to do our job. I think we build our credibility based on sort of reporting fairly and accurately, and you keep doing that. You put your head down, and again, there are many reasons that have nothing to do with the press of why people are not trusting the press. We can't change all of that. But what we can do is we can do our jobs.
Thank you for your two doors on. Is a solution to the problem you identified to strictly segregate reportage based on fact as opposed to op-ed pieces? I mean, that's done, I think, extremely well by the Wall Street Journal, where
Right.
The reportage is of a very, very high quality.
Right.
I mean, the op-ed pieces have their labels stuck on them, so you know they're op-ed pieces. And whether or not you agree with them, I like the reportage because it's accurate. Now, in
Right.
English journalism, it's very different, where the opinions shade into the reportage itself, like
Right.
in The Economist, or take another end of the spectrum, Daily Mail, which sort of advocates for Brexit and so on. But in the Wall Street Journal, which I think has probably a higher standard reportage than, say, New York Times, the strictness of the reporting is extremely impressive. Is that not a solution?
Yes, absolutely. So I referred earlier to labeling. I think absolutely one of the solutions is to just be very clear. I think there's been a lot of conflation of analysis. So we have reporting, and then we sort of put some analysis in, and analysis can sound like commentary, which can sound like opinion to the listeners or to the reader, and they're not very clear about which is what. So absolutely, I think if we are labeling what is this here? Is this reporting? Is it based on facts? Again, that goes back to sort of the annotation. You can annotate, these are where our facts came from. We didn't make them out of whole cloth. We asked specific questions. I know it sounds very basic, but I see some skepticism there. But I do think we've sort of gotten away from some of that. We've sort of said, trust us, and people are saying, no, we're not going to. So.
I think we'll take 2 final questions.
Hi, Elizabeth. Stacy Samuel, Weekend Edition as a fellow NPR
Hello.
employee.
Hello. Yeah.
I want to tell you, your critical eye keeps us honest,
Okay.
and the fact that I don't hear from you is actually a very good thing. So, I did want to say though, I wanted to address the question about the economy because
Yes.
as the supervising editor for Weekend Edition, I read a lot of those emails that you read and
Yes.
have to address.
Yes.
And I will say that a lot of the numbers that we get that pertain to the economy, we get those figures from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. You know, they come from the government themselves, and then it's up to us to figure out how to parse it, how to tell it, and how to share it. I think in order to address what you're asking for, which I could absolutely see, now we're moving into investigative journalism, which is an entirely different area and requires a whole other area of funding and dedicated resources, not that we don't do it. But there are so many topics that we address, at least in our newsroom, in the newsrooms that I've been in, prior to NPR, at CBS News, and at CNN. They take longer, and there are many other topics that you know, require, you know, deep dives and real hard looks. And I don't find many economists coming into newsrooms and looking for jobs that we don't wake up in the morning for the paycheck. You make a lot more money doing other things. But I absolutely agree with you. And we're just challenged in that we deal with the numbers that are given to us. But I had a question for you. I wanted to say, you know, in the 10 months that I've been at NPR and, you know, following the results and the outcome of the election, I find not only in our newsroom, but in newsrooms across, you know, all organizations, talking to my colleagues and friends and cohorts at different organizations, you know, there's been this move to overcorrect because
Yes.
we got it wrong and we
Yes.
didn't read the tea leaves. We weren't talking to the folks in Toledo, Ohio. You know, we're giving more of a voice, or we're seeking desperately to find those voices, Republicans, those with agendas like Laura Ingraham. So in this overcorrection, I feel as though we may be giving a very big microphone to people with agendas in hopes of not getting it wrong the next time. Oh, we need to hear them. And the challenge and the fear that I have is, well, and the balance that we're always seeking, at least at our table, is, oh my God, are we normalizing their agendas, you know, and that's always a challenge. So if you wanted to talk a little bit about how do we prevent the normalizing, because, you know, that continues to be a big question. How much weight do we give certain folks with agendas and, you know, address what it is our listeners are really needing in order to make informed opinions or decisions?
It's a good question. I've seen some overcompensation, absolutely, across the board at many news organizations in the wake of the election. I think everyone is trying to grapple with this. My own feeling is that it's, you know, parachute journalism is not enough. So I think I've seen a lot of parachute journalism, which is, oh, we don't have reporters in Toledo or wherever, so we're just going to drop people, you know, drop our reporters in, and they're going to do some quick on the ground hits and talk to a few people, and you know, that's not really going to get at the problem or the situation. So reporting is often a long-term process. I think we're better at reporting something like the opioid crisis. We're not as good at reporting long-term stories that lead up to the opioid crisis. So the opioid crisis is a great, powerful story. We have to cover it. But there were decades of developments that led to that. I mean, it didn't just sort of come out of nowhere. That is not a story that the national press is very good at covering. What did someone say the other day? We're good at covering stories that break, but not stories that bend. You know, so that you don't get that by sort of dropping in the country and saying, hey, tell me what you think, or you get that by doing deep on the ground reporting over many, many years and having people in place to see these stories as they are bubbling up. That's expensive, and it takes time. It's not sort of an overnight fix. So I agree with you. There's been some sort of overnight fixes that have not felt very satisfying. And I think sort of the the solution is much longer term and figuring out how to get at some of those stories that are really underneath sort of the big obvious developments that we've seen.
Oh, first of all, on behalf of the East-West Center, I really want to thank you so much,
Thank you.
Elizabeth, for this wonderful, insightful, thought-provoking talk. So thank you so much for coming, and please come back again in the future.
My pleasure.
But the question I've been grappling with is when early on in your talk, when you mentioned how the media, the approval of the media has so much lessened, in the last 20, 30 years or so. And I was thinking, why is that? A thought that popped into my mind, which I personally am upset with, and probably many others in the community, is Honolulu, for example, used to be basically a 3-newspaper town. We had 2 major newspapers, plus we had an alternative weekly, and all 3 of those journals had robust investigative reporting going on. And because of that, and of course that has so much lessened. Now we have, 1 newspaper that seems to be, gradually shrinking in size, fewer pages as the years go on, and we don't see the robust investigative reporting anymore. In fact, the investigative reporting has shrunk to, 5–10% of what it used to be. And my thought is that the newspapers and the media, in a sense, using the term ombudsman, was really the ombudsman for the society as a whole. Powerful political, business leaders in the community always had to be concerned that if they didn't act ethically or appropriately or properly, there was going to be investigative story on them. And it really helped to keep the powerful forces in society honest on their toes. Without having that anymore, I think the community at large feels that somehow we're much more vulnerable. Without that powerful local press doing the tough investigative work. I know you've mentioned some possible alternatives that might be, helping us, but can you give us some thoughts on that and how we can, kind of regain what we lost?
It's challenging. First of all, I agree with you absolutely. Excuse me. Investigative reporting is key. I called out NPR in one of my columns for not doing enough investigative reporting of its own during the election, the 2016 election. I think it's a fundamental. It's one of the fundamentals of journalism, and it's a way that journalists can make their mark. It's really, again, what is investigative journalism? It's digging below the surface to sort of figure out what is really, what is not obvious. So we don't need to report the obvious. We need to figure out what else is going on. In terms of coming up with an economic model, no. I think that is, excuse me, I think that there are a number of organizations looking at that. I think LendFest is it's a foundation in Philadelphia that's really trying to put together some of these resources to help local communities come up with ways to support investigative journalism. It doesn't happen overnight. I absolutely think it's a challenge. I think you've identified the right challenge. I don't know if I have the answer as to how it's going to be funded. So. Mm-hmm.